Records disappear. That is the nature of atrocity. Those who commit it rarely wish to be remembered, and so they burn, they bury, they revise. But sometimes, something survives. Sometimes, a single document endures long enough to force the world to look at what it would rather forget. And sometimes, what survives is more disturbing than the absence ever was. Sometime in the 1870s, a ledger was recovered from the ruins of a collapsed storage building on the grounds of the former Harwell Plantation in Tensas Parish, Louisiana. The ledger had belonged to the plantation's owner, a man named Gideon Harwell, who had managed that land through the final brutal decades before emancipation. The book itself was unremarkable, cloth-bound, water-warped, its pages brown at the edges. What was inside, however, was not unremarkable at all. The ledger contained names, hundreds of names. This was not unusual for plantation records. What was unusual was this. Some of those names belonged to people who had died years, sometimes decades, before the dates beside their entries. And some belonged to people who, according to every other surviving record, had never existed at all. Who were they? Why were they there? And what did Gideon Harwell know that he never told anyone? That question would haunt a small corner of Louisiana for the better part of 40 years before someone finally came close enough to the truth that the truth became unavoidable. Before we continue with the story of the Harwell ledger and the names that should not have been there, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What city or state are you in right now? We love hearing from you. Now, let's go back to Louisiana and let's find out what Gideon Harwell was hiding. Tensas Parish sits in the far northeastern corner of Louisiana, pressed against the Mississippi River's older channels. Bayous wide and slow as sleeping animals, draped with cypress and Spanish moss, so thick it filters the light into something amber and diffuse, something that makes mid-afternoon feel like late evening, and late evening feel like something without a name. The land is flat and wet and ancient, and in the years before the war, it was cotton country, some of the most productive, and therefore some of the most relentless, in the entire South. The Harwell Plantation was established in 1831 by Gideon Harwell's father, a Virginia-born man named Archibald Harwell, who had come west with capital, ambition, and the particular moral convenience that allowed men of his class and era to look past what it cost in human terms to make that capital multiply. Archibald cleared land, drained swamps, built the principal house, a two-story frame structure, white-painted, with a wide gallery across the front. And by the time he died in 1849, he had turned a muddy Tensas Parish tract into one of the wealthiest single-planting operations in northeastern Louisiana. His son Gideon inherited everything at the age of 26. He was not the man his father had been, and most people who knew both of them said so with some frequency, though they rarely clarified precisely what they meant. Archibald had been forceful, sociable, the kind of man who presided over a dining table with the comfortable authority of someone who genuinely believed the world had been arranged for his benefit. Gideon was quieter. He had studied for 2 years at the College of William and Mary before illness brought him home, and he had returned with a quality his neighbors found faintly unsettling. Not cruelty, not exactly, and not weakness either, but a kind of careful attention that expressed itself in silence where another man might have spoken. He watched. He recorded. He kept accounts. That habit of recording would outlast him by decades and eventually undo everything he had spent his life constructing. The plantation ran through the 1850s at the peak of its operation, ginning somewhere between 300 and 400 bales of cotton per season, with an enslaved workforce that Gideon maintained at around 120 people. He was known in the parish as a careful manager rather than a violent one, which in that context meant only that documented incidents of extreme punishment were less frequent on his land than on some of his neighbors. The ledger he kept was meticulous. Every name, every age as best as could be estimated, every assignment, every acquisition, every death. It was that last column, the column that tracked deaths, that would eventually become the thing no one could explain. The ledger was not discovered cleanly or dramatically. There was no single moment of revelation, no scholar lifting a pristine volume from a forgotten chest. The reality was messier than that, and messier things tend to be more credible. The storage building that housed it had been part of the original Plantation complex, a low-slung timber structure used in its working life for storing tools, seed stock, and various overflow goods that had nowhere better to go. After the war, after emancipation, after the Harwell family's fortunes collapsed with the speed and totality that tended to characterize the ending of a system that had been entirely dependent on stolen labor, the building fell into disuse. The main house changed hands twice between 1866 and 1872 and was eventually purchased by a northern-born cotton factor named Bernard Oakes, who intended to continue working the land on a sharecropping basis and needed to assess what infrastructure he'd bought. In the summer of 1873, while Oakes's workers were clearing and inventorying the outbuildings, one of the storage structure's interior support beams failed, bringing part of the roof down. No one was seriously hurt. When the debris was sorted through, a tin box was found wedged beneath the collapsed beam, apparently thrown from a shelf above and protected from the full weight of the fallen timber by the angle of its landing. Inside the tin box were 3 items: a worn leather wallet containing nothing, a sheaf of letters tied with cord, and the ledger. Oakes, being a practical man and not particularly interested in the record-keeping habits of former slaveholders, set the tin box and its contents aside in the main house. The letters were written in a hand he found difficult to read and addressed to a woman whose name he did not recognize. He meant to have someone look through them eventually. He did not, in fact, ever do so. It was his wife, a Massachusetts woman named Clara Oakes, who first actually read the ledger. She did so on a rainy October afternoon in 1873, with no particular purpose in mind beyond curiosity and the restless energy of a woman confined indoors. She began at the front, where Gideon Harwell had recorded his initial inventory of the property he had inherited, and she read forward chronologically. She read for approximately 2 hours. Then she set the ledger down on the parlor table, went to the window, and stood looking out at the bayou for a long time without moving. What she had found was this. Near the middle of the ledger, in entries that covered the period between roughly 1851 and 1857, names appeared in the deceased column that Clara recognized from earlier sections of the same book. Not the same names in the way that common names recur across a population. The same names, the same ages, the same descriptive notations that Harwell had used to distinguish individuals. A man listed as tall, marked left cheek. A woman noted as speaks some French, good with children. A child described simply as boy 7, purchased Natchitoches, March 1844. All 3 had been recorded as dead. The man in 1848, the woman in 1847, the child in 1846. All 3 appeared again in the 1851-1857 sections of the ledger, alive, assigned to field work or domestic duties, with small notations beside their names that Clara could not immediately interpret. She told her husband that evening. Bernard Oakes was a methodical man, and his first instinct was the most rational one: clerical error. Harwell had made mistakes, confused names, duplicated entries. It was the kind of thing that happened in large, handwritten records maintained over many years by a single person without institutional oversight. This explanation satisfied him entirely and almost satisfied his wife. Almost. Because there was something else in the ledger, something smaller, stranger, that she had not mentioned to Bernard yet and would not mention for several weeks. Tucked between 2 pages near the back of the book, written not in Harwell's careful copperplate, but in a different hand, cramped and slightly uneven as though written quickly or under some form of pressure, was a single sentence. They are not the same ones. That was all. 5 words in someone else's handwriting, slipped between the pages of Gideon Harwell's ledger sometime before or after the ledger was sealed in its tin box and left there. Clara Oakes did not sleep well that October. The sentence rotated in her mind the way that certain phrases do when they attach themselves to a question you cannot stop asking. They are not the same ones. Not the same ones as what? Not the same as the people recorded under those names earlier in the ledger. If so, who was writing the note, and to whom, and why? Why would someone feel the need to clarify in writing, hidden within the document itself, that the living people bore the same names as the dead? She wrote a letter to her brother in Boston, a man named Thomas Garrett, who taught history at a small college there and had a particular interest in the record-keeping practices of the antebellum South. She did not describe the note. She described only the duplicate names and asked whether he had encountered similar phenomena in plantation records. Thomas Garrett wrote back in 3 weeks. He had, he said, heard of deliberate name falsification in plantation records, usually for purposes of tax avoidance or the concealment of illegal slave trading. He had also heard of clerical error producing apparent duplications. He had not, he said, encountered a case where the same descriptive identifiers, the physical markings, the noted skills, the documented origins, were applied consistently to both the dead and the living entries. That, he said, was unusual. He said he would like to see the ledger. Thomas Garrett arrived in Tensas Parish in the spring of 1874. He was 41 years old, a lean, precise man, with spectacles that he was constantly removing and replacing, and a habit of taking small, rapid notes in a pocket-sized book he carried everywhere. He had spent the previous 15 years studying the documentary history of American slavery, not from any particular political motivation, he would have said, but from what he called the historian's fundamental obligation to the evidentiary record. He believed that the past could be known if one was willing to be rigorous, and he was rigorous. He spent his first day at the Oaks Plantation simply reading the ledger from cover to cover, speaking very little, and eating lunch at the parlor table without appearing to notice what he was eating. Clara watched him read with the particular attention of someone who has been carrying a private anxiety and is hoping someone else will either validate or dismiss it. By evening, Thomas had filled 11 pages of his small notebook. "It is not clerical error," he said at dinner. He said it without preamble, as though continuing a conversation already in progress, which in his mind it apparently was. "The duplicate entries are too consistent. A clerical error produces inconsistency. A name repeated with different ages, different physical descriptions. What we have here is the opposite. The same person as described, appearing as deceased and then appearing again, alive, under circumstances that suggest Harwell was aware of the duplication and was not troubled by it. Why would a man not be troubled by recording a dead person as alive? Bernard Oakes asked. That is precisely what I intend to find out, Thomas said. He stayed for 6 weeks that spring. He went through every document in the tin box, including the letters, which turned out to be from Gideon Harwell to a woman in Natchez, Mississippi, a correspondence that shed some light on Harwell's character and personal life, but nothing immediately relevant to the ledger's anomalies. He spoke to as many people in the parish as he could find who had any memory of the Harwell plantation during its operating years. This was more complicated than it sounds. The people most likely to know what had actually happened on that land were the people who had been enslaved there, and they were not necessarily inclined to speak freely to a northern white man who showed up with a notebook and a lot of questions. Thomas was aware of this. He was, for a man of his era and background, unusually aware of it. He hired as an intermediary a man named Robert Dufour, a free-born Creole man of color who had lived in Tensas Parish his entire life and had an extensive network of relationships across the parish's black community. Robert was 48 years old, had worked as a barber, then a school teacher, then a political organizer during Reconstruction's brief and increasingly dangerous flowering, and he regarded Thomas Garrett with the careful, assessing attention of someone who has learned through long experience to take the full measure of a stranger before deciding how much to trust him. They reached an understanding over the course of several days. Thomas wanted information. Robert wanted something more complex. He wanted whatever was true about the Harwell plantation to be written down correctly. by someone with the means and the standing to make it matter. He had grown up hearing stories about Harwell. He had grown up knowing that something had happened there that people spoke of only obliquely, in parts, in the way that communities sometimes encode their most difficult knowledge in fragments too small to be seized and too persistent to be lost. What Robert told Thomas in those early spring weeks was enough to keep Thomas Garrett in Louisiana for the better part of the next 4 years. The story that Robert Dufour carried, assembled from years of listening, from the recollections of older people in the parish who had been children or young adults during the Harwell years, from fragments of conversation and deliberate silences and the particular weight that certain names carried when they were spoken, was not a single story. It was several stories that overlapped at their edges, like the rings of a felled tree, each one containing something the others did not. The oldest layer of the story began around 1848 or 1849, which Thomas noted was precisely the period corresponding to the first anomalous entries in the ledger, the earliest deaths that would later be echoed by living entries bearing the same names and descriptions. In that period, according to the oldest and most fragmented accounts, several people on the Harwell plantation had been sold, not to nearby plantations, not to the casual lateral transfers that were common in the Cotton Belt, but sold away, south and west, in the direction of the New Orleans markets and the deep trade routes that fed them, sold so completely that no one who knew them ever heard from them again. This was not in itself unusual. It was a horror common enough to be ordinary in that world. What gave the accounts their particular texture was the insistence in several separate testimonies collected by Robert and Thomas independently that the sales had been concealed. That Gideon Harwell had told the people remaining on the plantation that those sold were dead. He told them the fever took them, one elderly woman named Dorothea said. She was in her late 60s, had been born on the Harwell plantation, and spent her entire girlhood and young womanhood there. She spoke to Robert in Creole French, which Robert translated for Thomas as they walked. He told everybody they passed from the fever in the same week, all 4 of them, same week in July. "Do you believe that?" Robert had asked her. Dorothea had looked at him with an expression that Robert described to Thomas as patience applied with some deliberate force. "I was 12 years old," she said. "My mother told me. People who die from fever, you see them sick before they go. You see them carried, you hear them in the night. These 4, one morning they were there, one morning they were not." If this was true, if Gideon Harwell had falsified deaths in the ledger to disguise sales he wanted to conceal, the first question was why. Selling enslaved people was legal, unremarkable, economically common. A man in Harwell's position would have had no practical reason to hide it, unless the sales themselves were somehow irregular. Thomas wrote that word in his notebook and circled it. Irregular. He needed more. What he got over the following weeks was less a cascade of revelation than a slow accumulation. Small pieces, each one almost nothing on its own, that began to form a shape he could half see and not quite name. A shape that he found, to his own discomfort, more disturbing the clearer it became. He learned that Gideon Harwell had maintained a private account at a bank in Vidalia, across the river in Concordia Parish, separate from the plantation accounts that his records reflected. A man who had worked as a clerk in that bank in the 1850s, now elderly and living in poverty in a Natchez rooming house, remembered Harwell visiting that account with a regularity that had seemed, even at the time, deliberate in its separation from his usual business. He learned that there had been, during the 1850s, a man who visited the Harwell plantation with some regularity. A man the enslaved community knew only as the counter, because of his habit of walking the fields and the quarters, with a small tally board, counting, never speaking to anyone directly, always accompanied by Harwell himself. Nobody knew the counter's name. Nobody remembered his face with any precision, only his habit. He counted. He made marks. He left. And Thomas learned this from Robert, who had heard it from a man in his 70s named George, who had been a teenager on the Harwell plantation and was now one of the only surviving people who had been old enough at the time to have formed real memories of what he witnessed, that there had been replacements. "George told me," Robert said one evening as they sat on the gallery of the Oaks house with the bayou going dark before them, "that after people were taken, not died, taken, he made that very clear, other people would arrive, not always right away, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months. But they would arrive, and they would be given the same work assignments as the people who had gone. And after a while, Harwell would call them by the names of the people who had gone." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The same names. The same names." George said at first people thought it was a mistake, or some kind of... He said the word his mother used was a game, that Harwell was playing a game with names. But then it kept happening, and George said his mother told him, "He's keeping something in balance." She didn't know what, but she said, "He needs the numbers to look the same. He needs the book to say the same thing it said before." Thomas looked at his notebook. The word he had circled, irregular. He was beginning to understand the shape of what he was looking at, and he was beginning to wish he were not. What Thomas Garrett spent the next several months assembling, with Robert Dufour's help and the cautious, incremental cooperation of a community that had excellent reasons for both wanting the truth known and fearing what telling it might cost them, was the outline of a transaction so specific in its corruption that it required the ledger's falsifications as a structural component rather than an afterthought. Gideon Harwell had been selling people illegally. Not illegally in the sense of breaking the laws of his state. Louisiana's laws, like those of every slave state, provided no meaningful protection to enslaved people against sale, separation, or anything else. Illegally in the sense that he had been selling people he did not own. This required some explanation, and Thomas would spend years refining his understanding of the mechanism, but the essential structure was this. Harwell had entered into an arrangement sometime around 1848 or 1849 with a network of traders operating the internal slave trade between the Upper South and the Gulf Coast markets. The arrangement was not simple purchase and sale. It was something closer to what Thomas, searching for language adequate to it, eventually called a substitution scheme. Harwell would identify from his own population individuals who could be, in the cold, actuarial language of that market, described as matching a particular profile requested by buyers further south. He would arrange the sale of those individuals, record them as deceased in his ledger, and then acquire replacement individuals, purchased quietly through channels that bypassed the usual auction markets, whom he would install in the same roles and eventually assign the same names. The ledger, which the state tax authorities used as the basis for the property assessment of enslaved populations, would show no net change. No one looking at the records from outside would see a transaction at all. The money went to the private account in Vidalia. The full scope of what this meant, its scale, its duration, the number of people affected, Thomas could not determine with certainty from the surviving evidence. What he could establish was that it had been running for at least 6 years, possibly longer, and that the replacement individuals who appeared in the ledger under the names of the people who had been sold were themselves almost certainly obtained through the same network. Likely people displaced from other plantations through similar arrangements, their own histories and names and identities ipped away and replaced with the administrative fictions that kept Harwell's books in order. The note hidden in the ledger, "They are not the same ones," took on a new dimension when understood in this context. Thomas had originally assumed it was written by someone external to the plantation, a clerk perhaps, or an auditor. He now believed it had been written by someone inside. Someone who knew exactly what the ledger's numbers represented and what they concealed. Someone who had written it not as an explanation, but as a testimony. A statement placed inside the document itself, in the one place it might survive, even if everything else was destroyed. He spent considerable time trying to determine who had written it. The handwriting was not Harwell's. It was not any hand he could identify from the other documents in the tin box. It was, he eventually concluded, the handwriting of someone who had not been in the habit of writing. The letters were formed carefully, but with the slight imprecision of a person for whom the act of writing was not fully automatic. Someone who had learned to write but had not written often. In the 1850s, on a Louisiana plantation, that description narrowed the field considerably, and not in the direction of white men with access to accounting ledgers. Thomas sat with that conclusion for a long time. Whoever had written those 5 words had understood what the ledger contained, had been close enough to it, physically close enough, to have placed a note inside it, and had wanted, with the particular urgency of someone who knew they might not get another chance, to leave a record that what the numbers described was not the truth. They are not the same ones. Not an accusation, not a plea, just a correction. The most minimal possible testimony against the most systematic possible erasure. Thomas Garrett was not a sentimental man, by habit or by training. He noted, in a letter to his sister written that fall, that he had found himself staring at those 5 words for longer than he could reasonably account for. If this story is giving you chills, and we are only just getting into the full depth of what Thomas Garrett uncovered, share this video with someone who loves dark, true mysteries. Hit the like button to help us keep telling stories like this one, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Because what comes next, what Thomas found when he started pulling on the thread of that private account in Vidalia, is the part of this story that no one in Tensas Parish wanted to talk about. Let's keep going. The bank in Vidalia, across the Mississippi from Natchez, had been in operation since the early 1840s under various names and ownership arrangements. In 1874, it was owned by a consortium of cotton factors and commission merchants, most of them relative newcomers to the region who had arrived after the war, and regarded the institution primarily as a mechanism for managing the crop lien credit that now bound the sharecropping economy together. The records from its antebellum period were fragmentary at best. The bank had endured a fire in 1863, a period of military occupation, and 2 changes of ownership in quick succession, none of which had been conducive to archival preservation. What Thomas found there was not records exactly. What he found was a name. The account that Harwell had maintained, the private account, separate from the plantation's commercial activity, had been opened in conjunction with another account belonging to a man named Clement Yates. Thomas learned this not from any surviving bank document, but from the elderly former clerk he had tracked to Natchez, a man named Augustus, who had worked at the Vidalia institution from 1849 to 1858, and remembered certain transactions with the tenacious specificity that memory sometimes develops around things it found troubling. Augustus remembered Clement Yates because Yates had frightened him, mildly but persistently, throughout the years of their professional acquaintance. Yates was a factor, a middleman in the cotton trade who managed sales on commission and, as factors frequently did, extended credit to planters against future crop yields. He operated out of Natchez and traveled regularly through the river parishes on both sides of the Mississippi. He was in his late 50s during the period in question, a compact and precisely dressed man who spoke little and noted everything, and whose habit of arriving at the bank without advance notice and conducting whatever business he had with an air of complete indifference to the presence of others had struck Augustus as the manner of a man who had long since ceased to expect scrutiny. Yates and Harwell had, in Augustus's recollection, conducted transactions together on at least 7 or 8 occasions over the period of his employment. He could not describe the nature of those transactions with any precision. The accounts themselves were the records, and the records were gone, but he described the manner of them, cash primarily, not transfers, not instruments of credit, but actual specie and banknotes carried in the kind of leather cases that travelers used for valuables. Money arriving in Harwell's account from Yates's, or from accounts that Yates managed as a factor. Regular, predictable, like a salary, Augustus said, though he immediately corrected himself. Not like a salary, like a fee. like someone was paying for something specific and paying the agreed amount each time. Thomas wrote Clement Yates's name at the top of a clean page in his notebook and began working outward from it. Yates had died in 1869, which closed some avenues, but he had left behind a son, a daughter, and a business partner, a younger man named Frederick Hale, who had continued operating the factoring business after Yates's death, and who lived in 1874 in a large house on the outskirts of Natchez. Thomas called on Hale twice. Hale was polite both times in the way that people are polite when they are deciding how little to give you while appearing cooperative. He confirmed that he had known Gideon Harwell, that Harwell had been a client of the Yates factoring business for many years, that their dealings had been entirely conventional in nature. He did not offer anything that was not directly responsive to a question, and he watched Thomas with the steady attention of someone tracking a threat. The second visit, Thomas brought Robert Dufour. This was a calculated decision. Natchez in 1874 was not a safe place for a black man to accompany a northern white man into the home of a prosperous former Confederate sympathizing businessman, and Thomas had thought about it carefully and offered Robert the choice. Robert had said yes without a great deal of deliberation, which Thomas later wrote he found both humbling and instructive. That Robert's willingness to take risks that Thomas himself would not have had to take was the kind of thing one noticed and did not entirely know what to do with. The effect of Robert's presence in Hale's parlor was interesting to observe. Hale became, if anything, more carefully controlled rather than less. He maintained the polished courtesy that wealth and long practice had given him, but something in his watching shifted. Thomas had been, in his 2 previous visits, a manageable quantity, a northern academic, annoying but ignorable. With Robert in the room, the social geometry changed in ways that seemed to make Hale less certain of his angles. Thomas had prepared for this visit differently than the first 2. He had, the previous evening, written out a precise description of what he believed he could establish about the arrangement between Harwell and Yates. Not everything, but enough. Enough to demonstrate that he understood the shape of the scheme. He read this description to Hale in a measured voice, watching Hale's face. Hale listened without expression. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence. "I was not involved," Hale said finally. "In whatever you are describing, I came into the business in 1862. Whatever arrangements Clement maintained before that time were his own." "I'm not suggesting you were involved," Thomas said, which was not entirely accurate. "I'm asking whether you know who else might have been, whether Clement Yates's network extended beyond his own accounts." Another silence. Hale looked at Robert for a moment, not with hostility exactly, but with the complicated attention of a man encountering something that didn't fit a category he found comfortable. Then he looked back at Thomas. "There was a man," Hale said. "I knew him only as an associate of Clement's. He operated further west, Texas, I think, eventually. He was in this region during the 50s. I don't know the full extent of his activities." He paused. "His name was Aldous Crane." Thomas wrote the name down. "What did Crane do?" "He facilitated," Hale said. The word came out with a kind of deliberate emptiness, as though Hale had chosen it specifically for its lack of substance. "Facilitated what?" Hale looked out the window at his garden. "He moved things," he said, "from one place to another, and he kept records of the movement, very precise records. He was known for that, for the precision." Thomas looked at Robert. Robert's expression did not change, but something in the stillness of it communicated something. A recognition, perhaps, that they had just found the edge of the territory they had been mapping toward. "Where are Crane's records now?" Thomas asked. Hale turned from the window. "I have no idea," he said. "And if I were you, Mr. Garrett, I would give considerable thought to whether you actually want to find them." Thomas Garrett spent the better part of a year trying to find Aldous Crane, or what remained of him. The search took him from Natchez to New Orleans, from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, and eventually to a small and diminishing settlement in East Texas called Garland's Crossing, where Crane had apparently spent the last years of his life in the condition of a man slowly divesting himself of everything he had accumulated. He died in April of 1871. He had been a widower with no surviving children, and he had died in the company of a woman who kept house for him and a neighbor who had come to check on him when the housekeeper reported he was unwell. The neighbor, a farmer named Walter, was still alive when Thomas arrived in Garland's Crossing in the spring of 1875 and was willing to talk with the loose-tongued eagerness of someone who had been sitting on a story and had long since stopped expecting anyone to come ask about it. Crane had been, by Walter's account, a man who seemed to have been eaten from the inside by something he never named. He had arrived in Garland's Crossing around 1865 with enough money to buy a modest house and parcel of land, and no apparent desire to do anything with either. He did not farm, he did not conduct business, he sat on his porch. He received occasionally letters from Louisiana and Mississippi that he burned after reading. He drank, moderately but consistently, in the way that people drink when the purpose is not pleasure, but maintenance. He was polite to his neighbors without ever becoming their friend, and he spoke about his past with the careful vagueness of a man who has decided that what he knows is not something the world should hear from him. But near the end, Walter said, he had talked. Not to Walter. Walter was clear about that, and seemed faintly wounded by the exclusion. But to a minister who came through Garland's Crossing twice a year, a Methodist circuit rider named Ephraim, who Walter described as a serious and somewhat severe man who had been moved, for reasons Walter never fully understood, to spend considerable time with Crane during his final decline. Ephraim was still circuit riding. Thomas found him in the fall of 1875, after a summer of letters and inquiries, at a camp meeting in Henderson County, Texas. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a voice that had acquired through years of outdoor preaching, a quality of projected clarity that made casual conversation feel faintly theatrical. He was not, he told Thomas, willing to share anything that had been told to him under pastoral confidence. Thomas had expected this. He had prepared for it. He explained carefully what he was trying to establish and what he already knew, and what he believed the consequences of silence were in this particular case. He did not make threats. He made an argument. The argument was essentially this, that the people most harmed by what Crane had been involved in had no other avenue for any accounting, and that the details Thomas sought were not confessional secrets, but historical facts whose truth or falsehood did not depend on Crane's private remorse. Ephraim listened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He told me that he kept a ledger of his own." Thomas went very still. Crane kept his own records. He told me he kept a record of every transaction he facilitated, every name, every origin and destination. He said he kept it because he believed. Ephraim paused, choosing his words with visible care. He said he believed that the worst thing about what he had done was not the doing of it, but the forgetting of it. He said that the system he had served depended on forgetting, that the people he had moved through it were meant to disappear so completely that even they would eventually lose track of who they had been. He said the ledger was his way of, I am using his word here, contesting that. He said he believed that as long as the names existed somewhere, in some record, then the forgetting was not complete. Thomas said, "Where is the ledger?" Ephraim said he did not know. He had not seen it. Crane had described it, but not shown it to him. He had said it was in his possession and that he had not decided what to do with it. After Crane died, his house was cleared by a county administrator. His modest estate, the house, the land, a small sum in a local bank, passed to a distant relative in Georgia who never visited and sold the property within a year. What became of any papers or personal effects from the house, Ephraim did not know. Thomas went back to Garland's Crossing. He spent 3 weeks there, searching every channel he could identify. He spoke to the woman who had kept house for Crane, an older woman named Mercy, who had survived Crane by 4 years and was now living with her daughter. Mercy remembered the ledger, not as a ledger, she had not known what it was, but as a book that Crane kept in a strongbox under his bed, that he took out occasionally and read from for long periods, and that he handled with the precise care you give to something fragile and irreplaceable. The strongbox was gone. The county administrator, Mercy said, had taken several boxes of Crane's belongings in settlement of minor debts. Some of those items had been sold at a public disposal. Others had been stored at the county office. Thomas went to the county office. The county clerk was a young man barely out of boyhood who had held the position for less than a year and knew almost nothing about what had been stored where or for how long. But he let Thomas look through the storage room, a low and dusty space behind the main office that smelled of old paper and damp wood. Thomas spent 2 days in that room. On the second afternoon, in a wooden box pushed to the back of the lowest shelf, he found a small leather-bound ledger with a metal clasp. The clasp was corroded but had held. The leather was darkened and stiff with age.